In light of the recent bit of growth on this channel, I felt it was warranted to explain what it's all about. From the outset, I must say that I'm incapable of regularly uploading videos or adhering to any kind of upload schedule. This is because I bury myself in what I'll nebulously refer to as volunteer work, and that takes precedence. And on top of that, this type of animated video takes a ton of time to make. I'm learning all of this as I go. I didn't know anything before I started making videos. So just these scenes depicted took me a long time to figure out how to do, let alone do them. So the word that best describes my intentions is simple. My goal is to break down complicated or ambiguous concepts so that they're more readily understood. On this channel, you'll find breakdowns of philosophical arguments, explanations of widely misunderstood and misrepresented topics, as well as the occasional response video, most of which will be accompanied by detailed and graphical explanations from multiple cited sources. My intended audience are those without a working knowledge of the topic at hand, and especially those who would disagree with what I say. So one of my goals isn't necessarily to make someone believe something, it's to break it down simply so a person who disagrees can more identify where he disagrees, and we can work from there. And now I feel compelled to say that when I refer to people without working knowledge, that doesn't mean I'm referring to those people as stupid in any capacity. No one has the time to learn every topic to any significant degree. Alright, now I'll better articulate the role I envision myself having. In the same elaborate style, I break down pretty much everything. Before proceeding, since I routinely refer to psychology to support my explanations, I wish to issue a disclaimer of sorts to make things clear. Psychology consists of generalizations of human behavioral tendencies, so please note that the various psychological phenomena and biases that are referenced in videos are intended to be just that, with few exceptions. A given psychological phenomenon or bias does not necessarily apply equally to all individuals and, in some cases, may not even be significantly applicable to a given individual. As such, a given psychological bias, such as confirmation bias, will only be applied to an individual when it's amply demonstrable. So since this video is just supposed to be an overview of my channel, I'm not going to go into any depth here about what I cite. That may be done in a future video. However, I will display a definition on the screen, and for each include 2 citations in the description box below, one for the definition and one for a related article. Alright, so let's get going. So it's pretty routine around here to have experts explaining what they know to other people who don't know. That's pretty basic. So in such cases, when a person appears to be knowledgeable on a subject, whether they are or are not, they are perceived to be in a position of authority on the matter. So this automatically has some influence upon the psychology of those listening. When you perceive someone to be an authority, you're more likely to take what they say as true, without looking into it yourself. And in a lot of cases, it's a lack of knowledge on the part of the listeners that prevent them from being able to examine it properly, or be critical of anything that's being said. This can occur even if the speaking individual is actually an expert in the relevant field. And this entails another form of bias known as the curse of knowledge. And this generally occurs when highly educated people on a subject lose the capability to relate to people who have no knowledge, and thus unwittingly fails to sufficiently simplify his explanations, so that uneducated people can grasp them. On the reverse, it might be the case that the perceived authority isn't actually an expert. And in such a situation, it could be the case that the speaker actually believes himself to be a sufficient expert. It can also be the case that the person is intending to use this to manipulate his target audience. And it could be a combination of the two. But ultimately, this can make it indistinguishable between an actual expert who is talking over the heads of his target audience and that of a person who does not know what he's talking about. So suppose for a moment we have a speaker who is not an expert. Any speaker attempting to convince an audience to accept the truth of a given conclusion will provide reasons or argumentation in favor of its truth. And these reasons and argumentation can be unattainable to an audience lacking the technical knowledge required to grasp it. So any reasons presented could be over the heads of the target audience, can include ambiguities that the audience doesn't know how to explore or identify, or they can be downright false, where the audience doesn't know how it's wrong or how to investigate its truth. And this is where many problems arise, most notably confirmation bias, the mother of all biases. When an audience already shares a conclusion with the speaker, then the reasons and argumentation the speaker provides to support that conclusion will be more readily accepted, despite them not being understood or being clear or even being correct. This tendency is very strong and very natural to us pitiful humans. So the other edge of this bias is to avoid or dismiss argumentations or reasons that go against the already held conclusion. So even if another speaker who is an expert and knows what he's talking about rises up and speaks against it, he will most likely be dismissed, and this is for a number of reasons. In many cases, a contributing bias is called the primacy effect. This explains that people tend to put the most confidence in that which they hear first. You've heard first impressions are the most important, right? This is a derivative of the primacy effect. Another bias is called the halo effect, and this occurs when the speaker is viewed as an expert in one particular field, say physics or theology. People will tend to attribute that expertise to other unrelated fields despite that person's actual education. This can have profound effects in the view of the audience. It could put, say, someone who is an expert in biology on the same playing field as someone who's an expert in philosophy, despite the biologist not actually being well educated in philosophy. Now, I could probably go on literally all day describing all the cognitive influences and bias that affect us when we're making decisions. So I'm only going to name one more thing to prevent myself from rambling on endlessly. And this would be the familiarity heuristic. A heuristic describes a methodology of thinking, usually a means of shortcut thinking. And this heuristic comes into play for an audience that's faced with two opposing statements that they can't make sense of. In the case of an audience that's overwhelmed by both people's explanations that go over their heads, as explained before, they will resort to that which is the most familiar. This is highly related to the primacy effect as mentioned before. But to reiterate, I'm not going to go into detail here. Now, let me get on to where I see myself in this. To start, I am not an expert in any of the fields I'll talk about. As such, I see myself as being a useful intermediate between the experts and the people lacking technical knowledge. My intention is to take the statements and reasons provided by these experts, whether they are experts or not, and to simplify and break down technical statements, to point out and explore ambiguous statements, and to point out statements that are demonstrably false. My intention is to make everything understandable to a layman audience. Now, naturally, this will entail some oversimplification, and this is where I'd like your participation. I highly value constructively critical comments such as this one, that point out either errors or oversimplifications. If you see anything wrong with my video in any capacity, I would greatly appreciate it being pointed out. I'm usually quite active and engaged in the comments sections, so I'd be happy to explain anything that's unclear or to acknowledge you. Now, in regard to the style of my videos, I'm a firm believer that humor is an invaluable tool for bridging gaps. I also make frequent use of analogies as explanatory aids. These are tools I employ to make my videos more watchable and to maintain the interest of my viewers. Now you may be wondering why I appear to be so hateful and abusive towards stickmen. I suffer from rhabdoandrophobia, which is a fear of stickmen. Now, before you laugh at me, let me share the traumatic event that caused this condition through the form of flashback. I hope you can now sympathize with me in my disposition towards stickmen. So as some of you may have guessed based on what I'm wearing, I'm also a HEMA enthusiast and collector of medieval and other archaic weaponry. Some of my personal collection is visible behind me. In addition to the main content on this channel, I will also be hosting videos relating to this topic. Some of these videos will be those that I have produced personally, and others will be videos by others, such as those reviewing my weapons. But they'll all be unlisted as to not interfere with the main content of this channel. But all of these videos will be accessible through my main YouTube page and through a public playlist linked below. So I hope you find the content of this channel useful or entertaining. Thank you for watching.